Today I'm with Jillian Reilly. Jillian has explored the future and change-making for many years. Her new book is The 10 Permissions, with the intriguing subtitle, Redefining the Rules of Adulting in the 21st Century. She combines activism, future-oriented thinking, and practical ways to move forward. Well, Jillian, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I want to talk about your new book, of course, 10 Permissions. But I also want to go back and place that in a context that I think is, from what I understand about what you've done, is really important. Could you talk to us a little bit about to my knowledge, the first book you wrote is called Shame, Confessions of an Aid Worker in Africa? Talk about a strong title. What is that about?
Well, firstly, thank you for making that connection because you're absolutely correct. There's a deep connection between the two projects, between the experiences that I'm trying to capture in both books. Shame, Confessions of an Aid Worker in Africa is about my own experience coming to South Africa as a young woman. I was 23 years old from the United States, wanting to be a part of South Africa's transformation to democracy. It now feels like ancient history, but for those of us who were around and remember, 1994 was the year of South Africa's first democratic elections. And I wanted to, for reasons that I can't, certainly in the space of this conversation, fully articulate, I wanted to be witness to this profound social change exercise. And so I managed to get myself here to South Africa, because that's where I am currently based, to work with a human rights organization. And that sort of set off, again, in the spirit of my book, a path that I couldn't possibly see at that point, and a body of work that was about sort of supporting people through profound change experiences. And oftentimes failing. And I think the title, Shame, is a reflection of my own shame that I felt for perhaps not bringing myself as fully and completely and honestly and as authentically to those processes as I could. We had all the money in the world. I worked for a big US aid agency. We were throwing a tremendous amount of resource at very complex social challenges and, quite honestly, often coming up short, not because of bad intentions, not because of, mismanagement or malpractice, simply because it was more complex than we were able or willing to engage with. And we kind of knew it, but we weren't prepared to deal with it. And I really felt like I, at the time, did not have the agency or authority to step in and step up in those conversations the way that I, in retrospect, wish I had. So yeah, I got a real crash education in what happens when people are attempting to navigate really profound change, either by choice or by force, by default, because change is occurring in their environment. And I learned a huge amount. And in many ways, the 10 permissions kind of, brings that conversation further, because a lot of what I learned, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, is around this theme of permission. Am I allowed to, as I said, be as authentic, to have the agency, to call on my fullest authority, to try to bring about change? Those were the questions that I started asking at a young age, and I kept asking them, and I still am. And the 10 permissions brings that around to our current context and the ways that we are all right now trying to deal with complex change in ways that I don't think we're really prepared for.
You also had a podcast
Mm-hmm.
called Courageous Conversations.
Yes.
And I found that interesting because in your Shame, Confessions of an Aid Worker in Africa, it was you. Primarily, you were speaking for yourself. Then in a podcast, talking to other people. And then in 10 Permissions, which of course we're going to get into in more detail, you're actually sharing, encouraging others. It seems to me you've gone like in 3 stages, from yourself to dialogues, and then now to really you feel like you have learned enough that you can really help other people.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of viewing that. And I think, if I'm honest, it took me a while to make that transition, as I think it does for a lot of us. I spent many years on this book in part because I was grappling with what was it that I had to share with people. Did I trust my own authority? Did I back my own experience and my own insight? So yeah, that has been, a path of a career and of a lifetime to get to a point where I felt like I could share my own insights. Courageous Conversations sits right in the middle of this body of work in terms of really wanting to engage other activists, other people trying to sort of support change in what the lived experience of that is. Because again, I think we often underestimate the challenge that comes with trying to show up to difficult change processes, and we flatten it out and we simplify it. And I really wanted to kind of talk to people in a more unvarnished and intimate way about what it feels like to every day, try and engage with really complex social challenges, because I think it can get cast as sort of, heroic and dramatic. And the truth is, it's often just, your willingness to persist through all sorts of internal and external challenges. And I wanted to create a platform for people to explore those experiences. So, yeah, I'm really proud of that piece of work.
Is the podcast still online?
It is. It is. It's so interesting. Yeah, it was funded by the Ford Foundation, and I like to think of myself as an OG podcaster because it was quite a while ago. But the beauty of the internet being that everything lives, so it is still there. It is South African activists, but I believe that their experiences are universal. And what's quite interesting for me when I go back and check it out again is that some of it is more relevant than ever in this specific moment as we talk about human rights, as we talk about LGBTQ issues. So, those struggles and challenges carry on for better or for worse. And there's a lot of richness in those conversations.
Interesting. When we move into 10 permissions, what strikes me, and I've read tons of books about how to work better, how to do this better. I worked I've always been an independent person, never an employee, but I have worked as a consultant to very large organizations, UN groups, regular corporations, a whole bunch of types of organizations. And one thing I wanted to say first, most books are not as actionable as 10 Permissions is. I was struck by that. I think that's important because, first of all, there's too many books out there now about how to do this, how to do that, but they're not actionable enough. That had to be one of your goals because it's so obvious. I mean,
I'm so pleased with what you're bringing up. It makes me feel so happy that that's something that you picked up on, because absolutely 100%, again, a lifetime spent in the business of change was that this is not about ideas. I have spent so much time, and it sounds like you have too, in rooms, in conversations, flip charts full of good ideas, post-it notes aplenty. The reality is to begin to show up differently to your life, to begin to make different choices, is a set of small actions. And so it is very much grounded in the reality of action and response. And and there's a workbook that readers can download when they buy the book, and it immediately takes you into an active space. Because for me, especially now when our brains are so overburdened, when we're so drawn into a sort of passive cognitive state so much of the time, it's really critical that we put ourselves into an active state of exploring new ways of showing up to our world. So yeah, 100%. It was intended to be that way.
It comes across that way. In all the different organizations I worked with, say over 20 years, I worked with a lot of UN organizations and a lot of corporations of hundreds of thousands of people, and smaller companies. For me, a small company is under 10,000 because I've worked with a lot of large organizations. And the ones who struck me the most were the peacekeepers,
Right.
the UN Peace Force, which I worked with for a week in Italy on some military base somewhere, because a lot of them, they were from all over the world, and a lot of them from Africa couldn't get the right to enter the United States. If you want to reach the UN property in the U.S., you have to go through the United States. You can't get off the plane and go straight to the UN headquarters. And so they held it outside the United States. And those people talk about activists. They were so strong in what they were doing, and they lived a reality that none of my other clients or that I had ever experienced. Now, something you talk about is the old logic and the new logic. Each chapter you begin, you have the old logic is and the new logic is. I know you can't go into too much detail because we only have a relatively short time to talk. But overall, for you, what's the difference between the old logic and the new logic?
Yeah, it was important to me with the book to kind of create an awareness of the sort of operating system that we're using. And because I think a lot of it can sit unconscious in our daily lives and in our ways of working. It's so deeply imprinted on us that we might not even be aware that it is a guiding logic in how we work. And I think in many ways we are, certainly my generation is, and I think younger generations are sort of torn between old and new, is, sort of what I would call a 20th century logic that was very much predicated on predictable outcomes, stable operating environments, linear paths, fixed hierarchies. And that produced its own kind of logic in terms of how to move through it, which makes sense. Your strategies and your rules were born of a certain operating environment, which we all know has radically changed. We all know we're living completely different lives in many ways to what we did 20 years ago. And yet our logic for how we move through that hasn't necessarily caught up in an intentional way. So this more fluid world, this less boundaried world, this more unpredictable world requires a different logic in order to find your way through it. And I think most people would say, yeah, of course. But I don't think we've
Mm-hmm.
consciously gone through a personal or collective exercise in saying, right, how do I need to update my mindset, my worldview, my set of expectations for how I believe I should move through this world and what I expect to happen as a result? So the old logic and new logic is really an attempt to kind of shine a light on what might be an unconscious way of operating for people, and to nudge them towards thinking about, is there a better way now that is better suited for these conditions?
You have a number of statements in your book that I think will startle people. They seem counterintuitive, like I said in my earlier
Mm,
comments to you. And one in particular is that you talk about achieving and overachieving,
mm.
seeking approval. And you say it's not a good thing to achieve and overachieve and seek approval. Now, most people would think seeking approval and achieving things is important.
Yeah.
And you're saying it's not a good way to be thinking.
Yeah, I think it can't be the foundational logic of your new operating system, because this is not a world in which you can immunize yourself from uncertainty through achievement, which is what you could in the old logic. If you achieved a certain number of things and certain types of things, because of course the goal in the old logic was to satisfy the needs of institutions and systems, right? They protected you in exchange for your labor and your loyalty. So it starts in school and it moves on to corporates and it goes on and on. And the idea was, if I satisfy the needs of the institution, it will look after me. And, of course, when we're working within systems, we need to do that. But we mustn't assume that by doing that, we will garner security and stability, because we won't. And we're living within that right now. Everybody's sort of preparing for themselves to get chucked out by corporates that will soon see them as irrelevant and unnecessary. So what I say in the book is that we've always believed that if we spin out enough achievers, that will then prepare you to move through your adult life. What it prepares you for is to satisfy the needs of an external institution. And what you need to start doing now is learn how to identify your own needs and wants and satisfy those. So, to use more familiar terms, it might be moving from an external set of motivations to more of an intrinsic set of motivations. So, or what I describe as sort of finding rather than following, right? You've got to bring that sort of locus of control inside, that agency and that authority, and certainly meet the expectations of whatever your role that you will be playing, but not necessarily assume that by doing so, you can sort of sit back and assume that the rest of your path will be clear.
Yeah. You say that we need to forget about the future. You don't
Yeah.
you don't mean erase it, And you said that
No,
deliberately, I'm sure,
I
to
did.
startle people. Yeah, of course.
Of
And
course.
that many of us are trying to work towards a better future. And here you are telling us to forget about the future. Now, explain what you're doing, Jillian. You've got to have a strong idea.
I do. Well, I mean, it's probably one of my favorites because, again, going back to my experience in sort of change and in large scale change, I mean, the late 20th century and was in corporates was, your strategic plan and your 5-year plan, and you had your big plan and you had your big vision and you worked backwards from there. So it was very much a sort of deductive way of working that worked very well when we believed that we could see the future. Um, in an incredibly volatile environment, it is very hard to work deductively. And so a lot of people start to feel deeply insecure because they can't see 5 years in advance. They don't know what the outcome is going to be, and they can get paralyzed by that. As you say, the deliberately kind of cheeky prompt to forget about it is what I call sort of marry big intentions with small attention. So, have a guide, not a plan. You don't know. Nobody can sit here right now and know what a long-term future looks like. So have a general idea, but be super attuned to sort of your shorter time frames. Really lean into learning as much as you can and being hyper alert and aware to your sort of near term operating environment so that that's the thing that's informing your steps forward, and to get a little bit more comfortable with shorter operating environments and more inductive ways of working, because I think that it's necessary in this environment.
That's one thing that struck me, might have been the first thing that startled me because I sort of scanned the book and then I went back and looked at certain sections more than others. One that really caught my attention the first time through was when you said you need to think small. Because so
Yeah.
often we tell people you need to think big, you need to have a vision, you need to have a strong sense. And your response is that you need to think small. And then you say you have to distinguish thinking small from small thinking.
You're right. Yeah, again, I think one of the legacies of the past sort of several generations was this idea of everything bigger was better.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've got two teenage sons, and I'm around a lot of young people, and I think the reality of the current environment is that, they are surrounded by possibility, but they're finding their way through it. They can't, make it into an elevator pitch. They can't contain it in such a way that it can be their big plan. And so if you feel like, the only way to move forward is by having this big plan that will inform the rest of your actions, you might feel like you're coming up short when you
Mm.
can't see it that clearly. I think again that what I say is, small thinking is kind of narrowed and blinkered, but thinking small is sort of step by step, finding your way.
Mm.
And it treats the uncertainty and the lack of clarity not as a threat to your ambition, but as an invitation to explore what's possible. Because we just don't know right now what is possible. And I think to try to contain it in something that looks familiarly big right now is to possibly do a disservice to what you could create
Mm.
if you were willing to spend a little more time in that sort of small navigation mode of moving forward and discovering as you go.
One thing that is similar to what you're talking about now that I loved is when you talk about that you need to look for trouble.
Yeah,
That is so good. It's like you don't want, it's a thing I teach all my clients. You don't want consensus in your organization. You want
right.
diverse thinking. You want discussion. You want back and forth and so on. I mean, you know about that as much as I do, but I've never gone so far as to tell my clients to look for trouble. So
Yeah,
talk about that a
yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it could play out in so many different ways. And, I've written those permissions very intentionally to allow for individual interpretation of them. But yeah, everything that you just said in terms of what I think has become a world in which we're frightened of friction. The world is at once so polarized and yet so sort of engineered for ease that it creates a strange situation where, we're fighting with each other in the comments section and yet we're afraid to walk out our front door.
Mm.
So, the willingness to engage in challenge, in hard things, in difficult problems, I think is critical right now. And yeah, it's a bit of a clarion call, especially to younger generations, to say, and this again goes into that conversation around achievement, because I think we've prepared a lot of young people to just build that golden resume, and they're afraid that anything that looks too hard or too contentious will get them into trouble, and then,
Mm.
somehow smudge their record. And what I say in the book is, go looking for a teacher, not a fight, because all the hardest things in the world are the best teachers. All the challenging conversations, the thorny problems, the stuff that requires you to pore over it for a while, those are the places where you learn and you grow. And I think, because we're being replaced by robots, as we're told every single day now, our ability to problem solve, our ability to create, our ability to connect as humans is going to become, and is right now, ever more important. So we've been engineered for ease, and I think now we need to kind of dig a little bit more into our willingness to go to the places that feel a little bit more troublesome.
And you think that's going to trigger innovation also?
I think, yeah, it must, it does. And I define innovation very broadly as, a better way to do something. So whether that's at an interpersonal level, whether that's, at a social problems level, whether that's just at a corporate innovation level, I think, our willingness to do hard things and have hard conversations in person, in front of each other, blood, sweat, and tears, is something that we need to kind of reinvest ourselves in.
Does that go along with a phrase you used, how we need to go astray? And does that mean simply off the common path?
Yeah, again, I mean, those first two permissions, which is be willful and go astray, I sort of see them as a foundational sort of mindset or worldview concepts, which were, you filled a role and you picked a lane and you stayed in it. And that was, how you succeeded. And your path forward was straight. If you asked somebody to envision it, of course they would envision a straight one. And the permission to go astray is one that recognizes, one, that those are unrealistic now, given the amount of change that we are experiencing and creating, but they're also undesirable, because in those straight paths, your learning is limited, right? Every time you turn left or right, every time you pause, every time you make a conscious decision not to just keep doing what you've always been doing, you will learn something. And so embedding learning, embedding change, embedding adaptation into your worldview and into your approach to how you move forward, I think is absolutely critical. And again, I'm speaking a lot to young people about that, which is to say, don't feel like there's something wrong if everything doesn't lead seamlessly one thing to the next. You don't necessarily want it to. And by the way, it's probably not going to. That might not be the way your generation's lives look. And that doesn't mean that there's a flaw. It doesn't mean that you're not capable. It just means that the world is operating in a different way now.
Does that make them feel sometimes? Or do you encounter young people who are concerned about how they will make a living, how they will eat, how they will feed a family?
Of course.
I mean, that's sort of a fundamental thing that you're a high level thinker and you're practical also, but there is that fundamental feet on the ground approach that you need to have with people also.
Of course. I mean, and that's, I speak to that context in, the unraveling of a lot of our set of expectations for how our lives are
Yes.
going to look. And what we believe was what I describe as a series of sort of if then, if I do this, then that'll happen. If I
Yes.
get my college degree, then I'll get a job. Well, no. If I pick the right industry, then I'll probably have a job for the rest of my life. No. So all those if then equations have fallen apart to a big series of what ifs. And, in many ways, the book is sort of saying you get to design different paths for yourselves now than the ones that I did, because the ways forward have multiplied and unraveled in all sorts of very confusing and absolutely glorious ways. But the real reality is the idea that you could seek security within a corporate and that it would look after you for your life, I think is the single biggest piece of the social contract that has fallen apart. And that is
Yes.
leaving a lot of people sitting there going, okay, so if it doesn't look like that, what does it look like? Is it just me bouncing around from one corporate to the next, hoping that they give me a job or they give me a job? And in many ways, be willful and go astray is to say you need to be designing your own portfolio. You need to be driving an approach to your own life that is not about a singular role, a singular company, a singular, set of capabilities, but something that's much more strategically diverse than that.
I think young people would really take to that. They would understand what you're talking
They do.
about. What about middle-aged people? That's a little different. Someone who's 40 years old and loses a job.
Of
I mean,
course,
to think that they need to sort of think about their path forward. I mean, they do, but
they
it's a
do.
much harder thing, much harder to
You
do, I think.
you've just hit the nail on the head. They do. I mean, my husband is a 50-year-old entrepreneur who's putting together, he's a fractional sort of commercial guy. If you'd asked him 10 years ago what his life would look like now, he would never have said this. But this is the reality that he is, I don't want to say confronting because that sounds like it was kind of laid at his feet
Hmm.
in a fully undesirable way. I think what he's also, if he steps into it and feels it fully, it's like, oh, okay, this is kind of interesting. I get to sort of manage a variety of different roles. One of the things that I talk about that I think is important for all of us, regardless of age, is this kind of I can versus I am mindset. So, sort of divesting your identity from your role or your profession, which we very
Mm.
much did. We were accountants and lawyers and doctors. And I think what we need to do now is see ourselves as people who are capable of doing a variety of different things and need to intentionally build those capabilities so that we can look at ourselves through a more flexible lens. Because, at middle age, if you do lose a job, going out and trying to find another one in exactly the same way now is probably not going to happen.
Pretty much impossible.
It's pretty much impossible. So, how, even at that stage, you start to build this portfolio approach. It's not to say that it's easy, but it is the reality. And in many ways, you will have a richer and fuller toolkit to carry along with you
Mm.
than that 23-year-old will. You'll have more burdens and responsibilities, which makes you feel
Yeah.
more frightened, but you'll also have more assets and resources to help you figure out where you go from there. In some cases, the book will speak to people who want to make change. In other cases, it will speak to people who have to.
Mm.
Regardless, I think we are dealing with a landscape where we've got to approach it in sort of novel ways. And yeah, that's what I hope the book will help people sort of feel more allowed to explore in a clearer and more courageous way.
Something I'd like to do sometime, but I didn't want to do it before our talk today was I don't know if you're familiar with my book, The Gig Mindset
Yes,
Advantage.
absolutely.
And it's not about the gig workers at all. It's a
Mm,
mindset and the way people
yes,
are in organizations. And I
yes.
had some case studies that were really interesting and all that. There are a number of features that I identified in my research that are very close to what you're talking about.
100%.
Very
Of
close.
course. Very close.
When you
And
talked about the portfolio, for example, that portfolio thing is, I think, essential.
it is. And Jane, I think we could do what's interesting for me is that, of course, for a lot of people, when you talk about portfolio, it'll immediately investments will come to mind, right? I mean, that's an intuitive link to that word. And in
Yeah.
that, it would make a lot of sense to you that you would have a variety of things that would perform differently under different circumstances, that you would want it to be diverse, that you'd want to keep some of it liquid and you'd want to perhaps have some other things that were long term. Like there's an
Hmm.
intuition around a portfolio that we deploy in other areas of our life. And in many ways, bringing that back to the work of your own way forward, I think it's that's where I see the opportunity for a lot of people. And the fact that you were talking about that, I think long before a lot of other people were, is one of the reasons that I was so excited about having this conversation with you and having you read the book,
Oh,
because absolutely these are very resonant ideas. And I think you were bringing these things to our attention well before people were actually ready to start to engage with them as much as they are now.
I think it was too early in some ways.
It's
The
okay. It's
book,
still there.
yeah, it was still there. The book was not a bestseller, which
Mm,
business books tend not to be anyway. And
right.
the thing I found interesting was, though, the thing that for me was even more satisfying than selling millions of copies, honestly, was the fact that so many people came up to me. I talked for a couple of years at a lot of conferences
Yeah.
and I wrote. And so many people came to me and said, "You helped me understand myself. Now I
Right.
understand why I'm uncomfortable in my organization, or now I
Right.
understand why my boss doesn't appreciate whatever." And a couple of people even told me they wish they'd read it earlier because they'd been fed up with their company. They left their organization. And one of my themes was once you recognize yourself as someone with a gig mindset, and I'm sure you'll identify with this, you can either stay in the organization and work on bringing about change, or you can accept it and just be sort of invisible in the organization because you need the job, you need the money, which is not so
Right.
easy to do nowadays. Um,
No.
or you can leave and start your own business. You've got three paths. Things were not, I would say things were easier then, Jillian, than they are now.
Very much so. Oh, very much
I
so.
mean, the last 5 or 6 years have been something.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways. So I started to write the 10 permissions during COVID. It wasn't called that. It wasn't the framing. There was still the theme of how do we find our way through uncertainty and volatility, but there was no way. I didn't have AI on my radar. I didn't have the dissolution of democracy in certain places on my radar. You
Yeah.
know, there were things that so I think that's what keeps kind of catching our breath is
Mm,
like we keep waiting for it to stabilize and it doesn't.
no.
And that's where it's like this idea that if I just hold on, it'll return to something that feels more familiar to me. I think what a lot of people are experiencing now is a sense of loss, that it's not returning. Somebody described the loss of predictable progress or the end of predictable progress. And I thought that was a really good way of summarizing
Mm,
what I think our generation got in the late 20th century, this idea that, everyone would continue to thrive and generations would better each other. And I think now we're sitting there going, maybe that's not built into the story. Maybe that's not an inherent promise offered to the human race. What do we do with that? It doesn't mean that progress isn't possible. It just means that it might not look the way that we expect it to. So I think there's a real disorientation right now with understanding what that could look like. And I think your work, obviously, my contributions are trying to say, we need to intentionally update the way that we're thinking about this because the old ways are not going to serve us in terms of finding our way through this, what I think is, to use a cliche, a new normal.
yeah. A question I always like to ask my guests who think about the future, which you clearly spend a lot of time thinking about. What kind of future, how would you describe the future that you would like to have for example, your children living in
Mm,
20
mm.
years from now? You said they're teenagers, so give
They
them
are.
another 20 years. What kind of world?
I think about it as a marketplace where people are able to sell their best contributions unfettered by outdated expectations of how they're supposed to behave, where they're able to create and recreate over and over again things that add value to companies, to communities, to institutions, a place where they are continually discovering and evolving and growing over a course of a lifetime, as opposed to sitting fixed in a certain role that they execute and replicate year in and year out. So a world of continued growth and contribution, because once we get through the sense of loss that, we're not being held and told who we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to behave so tightly, we find it within ourselves to kind of come into ourselves a little bit more and figure out, what do I want to be a part of creating? What do I want to create myself? Whether that's relationships or projects or companies, whatever it is, where there's a spirit and an ability to bring our very best offers. And, one of the things I talk about in the book is, I don't know if you got to it, but was like the DJ as the sort of image of the
Oh,
future creator, who's not necessarily creating master works of art a la Da Vinci, but is routinely bringing something of value to different situations, and in the process bringing meaning and joy and connection to other people. I would like them to feel fully able to show up to that marketplace as their very best selves with their very best contributions. And that within that space, we're able to kind of find new ways of moving forward together.
in order for that to work, there need to be changes in the infrastructure around us, the human
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure around us.
Yeah.
And I don't know what you think about the idea of a sort of a basic income
Mm.
for everyone, so that, I mean, there's so much money in governments that if it were not spent on other things, it could be done. It
Yeah.
could be low, but it could be just enough to give people that little safety net that they need to have in order to think about what they want to do, what they want to become, and how they can make things better. But if you're worried about how you're going to pay the grocery bill, you
Yeah.
don't have a lot of energy to think about how can you make things better. Yeah.
Well, I think, the AI revolution is forcing and will continue to force a really deep rethink on, not to sound too lofty, but human existence. I mean, I
Mm.
watched Bill Gates on a podcast kind of questioning the fact that human beings exist for their labor. I mean, that's a fundamental framing of human existence, right? We are here to work. We are here to provide
Yeah.
labor. And we have come to believe that and to see that as a result of, hundreds of years of cultural framing around the reasons for us being here. Now that a large amount of our work is going to be done by machines, what are the implications for us in terms of understanding our purpose? There's a lot of AI is coming for your job narrative out there. I think alongside that is some deeper reflection around, is my job the reflection of my worth and of my value here on earth? Or am I allowed to imagine a world in which I make a contribution that isn't entirely about my job? So these are much bigger questions. And, you go there and a lot of people go, oof, it sounds like you're, getting into deep existential territory. But it's not that far away that we're going to be having conversations that only a decade ago were unthinkable. So I
Yeah.
think we need to, again, give ourselves permission to have conversations that might freak us out a little bit in order to really explore the possibility that's being laid on our doorstep at this
Yeah.
moment.
I like some science fiction for that purpose. One of the really great writers, a Chinese guy that I interviewed, he was my first interview, in fact, over a year ago,
Okay.
Stanley Chen Chi-fan. He co-authored a book. The title was similar to 2041 Visions for the Future or something like
Mm,
that. And
mm,
his co-author wrote the technical things that were going to happen. A lot of them are out of date now.
right.
And he had chapters in between each one of the technical ones that they had worked out this pattern together. And his was pure science fiction stories about people. And some of
Yeah.
the stories are just really, really powerful, really
Yeah.
powerful. And I think that there's some science fiction writers who are with their feet on the ground, who are thinking about things that are important to all of us. I think they're a good source of ideas.
100% agree with you. And I think we almost have to reframe science fiction. It was always this sort of, sat in a world of fantasy. And now I think it's a permission slip in and of itself to go
Mm,
beyond the the default narratives and the constraints that normally frame our thinking. Within that, you're allowed to kind of bring forth worlds that within, real life would feel too frightening or too other to
mm.
entertain. But in those spaces, it's like, huh, yeah, maybe it could look like that. Maybe that is a possibility, a desirability. So I absolutely agree with you. I think reading science fiction, engaging in those worlds and communities and conversations is a great way to kind of stretch out a little bit your own capacity for exploring the new and the different and what might feel unthinkable on some levels.
I think at some point it was Arthur C. Clarke who said that once work was gone, as far as we were concerned, education and entertainment would be the same thing. Our ways of educating ourselves would be entertainment and vice versa. I think that's a strong statement. I like that a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in many ways, I mean, you know, my sons, I would say their primary education, and this might horrify us or whatever, but I mean, the amount that they learn through TikTok, the amount that they learn online, the stuff that they come to me with that blows my mind that they know it. And I know we sit and wring our hands about their digital lives, but the reality is their digital lives are stretching them out into issues and parts of the world and people that were absolutely unavailable to me.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think we're already very, very close to that world where the lines between education and entertainment are blurring. I'm not sure the educators want to believe that, but I think we
Yeah.
probably are very close.
Well, I love your story about your sons. That's a anecdote I will probably use again in the future.
Yeah. They, you know, I start off the book by saying I'm a mom to two Gen Z kids, and yeah, they're my passports to a different way of looking at the world. And it's critically important to me that I don't keep them tethered to a world that makes me feel safe, simply because
Mm.
it's familiar to me. I mean, it's really important to me that I allow them to go out and explore what's possible and don't make them afraid of that simply because I don't understand it.
What you're saying is incredible, Jillian, because my 2 interviews ago, I interviewed Debbie Urbanski, a sort of a science fiction writer, but a fantasy science fiction. It's hard to describe her. In her most recent book, it's called Portal Mania. And the idea is we have portals that we go through or don't go through. It's fat. You would love it. You would absolutely love it because one of the things she says is exactly what you just said to me. Several of her stories have to do with the parent, I think it's usually the mother,
Mm,
who either lets her kid go into a new world via the portal or
mm,
tries to keep the kid back.
right.
And it's very difficult for a parent because when the child goes through the portal, you cannot follow him. You don't live in that world. And that
No,
child will see and experience things that you cannot imagine. That's
right.
one of our very strong points. And that's exactly what you said. I'm
Yeah.
amazed.
And I think so I'm actually doing talks with parents right now because I think what's really challenging for us, now every parent, every generation sees children off into a world that is in ways unfamiliar to the one that they came of age in.
Hmm.
But I think there's something more profound right now in that, you know, we are really sending them off into a world and a world of work and you know, the fact that we're sitting having conversations about the end of work is telling us that, you know, this is truly a world that it frightens us as parents. And our instinct, of course, is to want to keep them secure. And our
Of
instinct, of
course.
course, is to treat familiarity as security and to double down on the known and the familiar. But we don't do them any favors by doing that.
Yeah.
It's really hard because you don't have a prescription, you don't have a playbook to hand them to say, go on, darling, get your, you know, degree in accounting and sit in your corporate office for the next 40 years and you'll just be just fine. We don't have a story to tell them about what their success is going to look like. And it can
Yeah.
make us feel very afraid and very incapable. But
Yeah.
I think it's critically important that we don't pass that fear onto them because they're actually more capable for this world than we can imagine. And we need to let them go and find their way into it.
Boy, it's almost like taking words out of Debbie's mouth. Do you know
Oh,
Debbie
well,
Urbanski?
no, I don't. I think I want
Oh,
to.
I thought it would be interesting if I could get the two of you on a conversation together about parents and children. That could be really
Oh,
interesting.
well, it would. And I'm telling you right now, you know, as a parent, working with parents, whew, it's, there's a fear narrative that has seeped into us as over the last, you know, decade and before that. But, you know, the fear narrative is very strong and it shapes a lot of parenting logic. And I think it does everybody a disservice. And I think part of my ambition with the 10 permissions is to allow us to let go a little bit of that fear because I think it limits our capability to really thrive in this world.
Jillian, is there anything? I think we're going to draw this conversation to a
Yeah,
close. Do you have
absolutely.
any final thought or comment that you'd like to make?
Well, firstly, I just want to thank you because I was so looking forward to this conversation. I admire the fact that you have been a consistent voice, kind of helping us see our way through change and in a very kind of human way, which I
Hmm. Well, thank you.
appreciated.
Thank you. I appreciate your saying that.
No, 100%. And I think for me, my 30 years of helping people find their way through change also brings me back to a deeply human place that I think, I said kids are equipped for it. I think we all are in our own ways, have this, in some of my work, I used to describe the explorer's mindset. We are able to
Mm,
go out
yeah.
and find our way, but we haven't had to. And now we have to. And we're kind of
Mm.
grumpy about it and we're kind of scared about it, but actually it can
Hmm.
be pretty glorious once you set off into the new and unfamiliar. So I
Yeah.
think that I'd love for people to, start to find their way to a more optimistic and a more optimistic vision for the future. Because right now, cynicism and fear are rife. And for me, one of the foundational permissions, and it's where I start the book, is permission to be optimistic. Like, because
Yes.
we
Yes.
won't create a better way if we just sit afraid that we're about to be rendered obsolete. So, let's dig a little bit into some of the maybe even childlike optimism to see what's possible in this moment. I'd really love for people to walk away from the book feeling a little bit of that.
Well, that's a great final statement. I want to thank you, Jillian. I've really enjoyed this conversation. We covered a lot of good topics. I've enjoyed it very much. So thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure. Anytime.